When I came to WTO, it was more or less, I don't want to call it a rich man club.
Back in 1997, you didn't need really to have to make the case for trade.
People were protesting because trade was good for the North and bad for the South.
Together with all the membership there, I was let down completely.
We missed it because of a bloody agricultural safeguard issue.
And I said, look, guys, I'm going to do my best. If you don't like it, throw it in the trash can.
Just compare the average trade-weighted tariff in 1980 and the average trade-weighted tariff today.
We have created an orderly global system.
We have achieved pretty significant things.
Ambassador Azevedo was the Director General of the WTO from 2013 to 2020. Thank you very much for being with us. Your roots at the WTO stretch back almost to the inception of the organization, to 1997. What do you consider to be the biggest changes that you've seen over that time?
One big change that we saw very early on was dispute settlement. How relevant it became so quickly, how all of a sudden the WTO was front page news across the world because of big findings and resolutions of disputes and things like that. That, I think, put the WTO at the forefront of the global economic governance. And all of a sudden the WTO became a big thing. All of a sudden the WTO became the object of protests and marches. The degree of impact and visibility that the WTO had at that point in time was really impressive.
Do you think that the power of this dispute resolution mechanism that we had, did that have an impact on the negotiation side as well, do you think?
I have no doubts about that whatsoever. It's one thing when you're negotiating a text that, at the end of the day, as far as legal undertakings are concerned, it's a best endeavor, I will try to do my best about this and that. It's another thing when you're negotiating texts and agreements where you are not only bound morally by what you're agreeing to, you're bound legally to things that you have to implement that sometimes would require changes in domestic law. And that at the end of the day, if you lost a case, a dispute in the WTO, the winning side could be imposing economic sanctions, trade sanctions on you. All negotiations here became much harder than they were before, because what we were negotiating here could change and still does change the day-to-day lives of citizens, and governments and their policies.
Back in 2014 at our public forum, you drew attention to the significant shifts in public perceptions about trade. In developing countries, support for trade was growing in a big way, whereas it was being scaled back in developed countries. So that was something you drew attention to pretty early on.
Yeah, sounds prophetic, doesn't it? I mean, 6 years later, everything we said at the time came to be. I remember when I first got in Geneva back in 1997, you didn't need really to have to make the case for trade. Everybody knew that trade was an important and essential ingredient for economic growth and for development. Everybody knew that. I mean, you didn't have to go on talking to people and explaining how trade improves their lives, how it lowers the costs of products on the shelves, how it improves the quality of living, and how it increases the real salaries of people around the world. Today you do. Today you do have to make the case. It's not taken for granted anymore.
Where have we fallen short of our objectives? Where could we have done better as an organization these past 25 years?
I think the WTO has to be constantly updating itself. For example, tariff negotiations or even disciplines and rules that we negotiated, 30 years ago they're completely outdated today. And I think that when the WTO came into force back in 1995, it was clear to anyone that it would need to keep updating itself. Even though it was built to avoid rounds, right? That was a notion at the time. The WTO ends the era of rounds. It was meant to be a permanent forum of negotiations where countries would be continuously negotiating amongst themselves, making deals and things like that without requiring those big, huge rounds of negotiations. Well, 6 years later, from 1995, a new round was launched. And I think that kind of single undertaking with that kind of ambition at that time was a very tall order for our organization that had been born just 6 years earlier. Yeah. And I think maybe that was the original sin.
What does reform mean for you? What are the most critical elements of any reform going forward?
I would say reform needs to be broken down in two elements. I think the first one is substance. What are the things that we need to work on that would update the rules book of the organization? And there's some work already ongoing. Fishery subsidies on the multilateral level. We have electronic commerce, facilitation for investments, small and medium enterprises, domestic regulation for service. All those things are not fully multilateral. They are plurilateral undertakings. But they are substantively things that are unavoidable. I mean, the 21st century requires us to look at these things. The second part, I think, is not substance, it's process. I think the WTO has to show flexibility when negotiating things. Not every country in 164 country membership will be ready to take a particular step, will be ready to make a particular type of commitment. So you cannot impose that on them. And at the same time, you cannot stop conversations, negotiations, and progress in those areas because some are not yet ready to do that. I think we have to find the kind of flexibility where nothing will be imposed on anyone, but no one is going to stop others who want to move ahead and do other things. Now, it's tricky. It's not easy. It's tricky because it sounds easy.
What achievements as Director General are you most proud of?
We have achieved pretty significant things. You know, Bali with the trade facilitation agreement, food security outcomes, and then after that, information technology agreement expansion, the elimination of agricultural export subsidies, which is something that we were trying to get for years and we couldn't do that.
What would you say was your most difficult moment in a tenure which of course had many difficult moments?
If I had to pick one, I would say Bali. That was really tough. When we were negotiating, we had all those all-nighters here in Geneva.
Yep.
You know, ambassadors locked in a room, in a big room, people bringing food in, talking, and some of them sleeping. I, myself, sleeping sometimes, I suppose. It was really tough because it was really an all-nighter. And then 1 or 2 days later, we had another one. And by the end of that process, we were all exhausted. And maybe that's why it happened.
Yeah.
Because nobody could take it any longer. We got on a plane going to Bali with no text.
Yeah.
We still had no text whatsoever. And we still needed to deliver. Because if we didn't deliver anything in Bali, I think we would be driving a stake in the heart of the organization.
How did it happen?
I think first members trusted the DG, me, to put a text. And they all came to talk to me, and I was listening to them, and they were all saying, don't put that. If you put that, I'm going to block it. Don't put this. If you put this, I'm going to block it. So there were all these threats of blockages, and I said, look, guys, I'm going to do my best. I'm going to put the text that I think all of you can live with, even if uncomfortably, but it's something that I think can be done. I'll do my best. If you don't like it, throw it in the trash can. And we put that out, and after a lot of commotion, then they all agreed. God, I get tired just remembering. People were so emotional. That I was very emotional at that point in time. At one point, I had tears in my eyes, even, and my family says that doesn't happen very often.
You weren't the only one. Before he became Director General, Pascal Lamy was Chief of Staff for the great EU Commission President Jacques Delors. He then became Trade Commissioner for the EU before coming to Geneva and serving as Director General from 2005 to 2013. Pascal Lamy, welcome. You were very closely involved in the negotiations that led to the formation of the WTO, the Uruguay round. When you think back to those days and you see where we are at the present, what surprises strike you about this place? How has it evolved in a way that perhaps you did not expect?
The great change is that obstacles to trade have been very significantly reduced. I think, nevertheless, that this has not worked exactly as we at the time would wish it to be the case, because it has been done in a way that is too slow as compared to what our ambitions were.
Specifically, what could you point to as an achievement of the organization that you think really stands out?
Just compare the average trade-weighted tariff in 1980 and the average trade-weighted tariff today, which is probably to the tune of 5%, which is very small as compared to what it was at the time. You've seen the impact of that on the growth of the international economy, on the growth of emerging countries. And I remember at the time of Seattle, for instance, which was a big episode in the life of WTO, that people were protesting because trade was good for the North and bad for the South. I mean, looking back to where we are now, if anything, the problem is that many people feel it's been great for the South and not that good for the North.
There seems to be a common theme that people in the developing world have a much more positive view of trade and globalization than those in the developed world.
Well, I think the reason behind that is fairly simple. Trade opening works, creates efficiencies, creates growth. This is the WTO mission. But what you do with these efficiencies, the way you share these efficiencies, is something that is done locally. It's not done globally. And the reality, and this is what the numbers say, is that in the North, the benefits of globalization have not been properly shared. Trade opening did not work for the benefit of all. Whereas on the southern side, it has worked for all because the benefits of trade have been much better spread, although inequalities have increased in the south as well as they have in the north. The size of the pie has grown much more in the south, which is why there is this discrepancy.
What would you say were the achievements of which you were most proud while you were serving here in Geneva?
Well, let me start with the part where I'm not that proud. My main regret is that we could not conclude the Doha round or open the conclusion of the Doha round in July 2008 when we nearly got there. Reality, as we all know, is that at the very last minute, after years and months and weeks and days of negotiations, we nearly got to opening the road for the final conclusion. We missed it because of a bloody agricultural safeguard issue. It was not a big issue. It was a small issue. And I've always thought that maybe if I had drafted this safeguard clause a bit differently, or if I had a better relationship with the US trade negotiator or with the Indian trade negotiator, or if I had properly prepared a conversation between them and their boss at the time, it might have been better. I have a question mark on this. Negotiations very often succeed or fail at the end of the day on a small thing. We all know that having done 99% of a negotiation is nothing if the remaining 1% doesn't work. Moving to things I think, did reasonably well. The first one that comes to my mind is certainly the way we coped with the 2008 crisis. When it happened, expectations everywhere would be that we would have a sort of repetition of what happened during previous global crises, a big surge in protectionism. We knew that. I'm very grateful that the leaders of the G20 at the time, George W. Bush, Gordon Brown, understood as running this G20 that my proposal that they should mandate the WTO to monitor these developments and to create a sort of name and shame system, which, to be very frank, was not in the statutes of the WTO. I'm very grateful that this way of reacting did work and protected the world from a protectionist wave. I think millions, dozens of millions, maybe billions of people benefited from that. The paradox of this major achievement is that it worked because we overstepped the official mandate of the organization. The second thing which I think we did well was, after this failure of the global agenda, was picking a few things in this agenda, starting with a trade facilitation agreement, which we prepared during the 2 or 3 years that followed this 2008 deadlock, and which finally came to fruition. I think if you look at the impact of this trade facilitation agreement, which never went to headlines because simplification of customs procedures and harmonization of customs declaration is not something that's shiny.
Yeah.
The great thing is that it matters for millions of small traders, entrepreneurs, companies, businesses. It did simplify international trade a lot.
What does WTO reform mean for you? What has to happen to make this organization better prepared to cope with the challenges we face today and tomorrow?
The short answer to this question, which could or maybe should be very long, is both on substance and process. Substance-wise, there are topics where we have to address a serious discrepancy between the WTO rulebook on the one side, disciplines, rules, commitments, and the reality of today's trade and economy. It's the case with subsidies. The agreement on subsidies in the WTO is weak. We have to do a better job of using trade to improve the environment. So subsidies, environment, I would add to that digital. If so much value lies in data, then we have to address this. And I keep saying, and I'm probably now in a better position to be free to say it, that we need to rebalance the governance of the WTO, which is unduly tilted on the direction of members and unduly constrains the capacities of the Secretariat. This organization is too much in the hands of its members, this member-driven mantra, and not enough benefiting from the formidable expertise, imagination, capacity of its Secretariat, and this needs to be rebalanced. I know it's a provoking for many members of the WTO, We need something which is a bit less member driven and a bit more secretariat driven. It would work much better and be much more efficient.
Dr. Supachai Panijpak, the fourth Director General of the World Trade Organization, served as DG from 2002 to 2005. Dr. Supachai, it's a great pleasure to have you with us. What have you seen as perhaps the most unexpected development involving the WTO over these 25 years?
The World Trade Organization has grown so much. I mean, in 1994, I recall we had something like 128 members, and now we have 164 members.
That's right.
Yes, we have grown a lot in terms of the coverage of the global trading system. More than 97, 98% of the global trade volume is covered by the membership of the WTO. Also, the numbers, the number of issues, the agenda of the organization has also grown precipitously, I think. It has grown from basically mainly only driven by negotiations in the areas of manufacturing sector. It has grown to encompass nearly all fields of economic involvement like agriculture, services, environment, particularly interests of the vulnerable countries and development concerns.
What would you say is the most important achievement that has been attained by the WTO during this past quarter century?
We have created an orderly global system that supports, I would say, the global development together. We have been able to reduce all forms of trade barriers, not only tariffs, but the kind of non-tariff barriers that used to exist before. We've seen many cases of disputes being resolved in a most creditable manner. I mean, although there's been some dissatisfaction, as we all know, with the dispute settlement system as it is, but I have seen most of the time, and during the term that I served, that we've been able to apply the DSB to the benefit of everyone with very much an unbiased stance.
What about areas where we could have and should have done more? Where have we fallen short of our objectives?
Maybe throughout the years, we might have been taking up so much on our shoulders. We might have not been established to do all these things at the same time. When I compare the kind of great efficiency that we've seen with the system of dispute settlement and compare it to the less efficient rules-making exercises, procedures through negotiations, when the process of judiciary becomes so strong and the process of rule-making become a little bit less strong, then you can see is that the pressure is being exerted on the organization to sort of legislate new rules instead of having new rules being negotiated and agreed among the members. Sometimes through adjudication, we have come to interpret certain agreements, certain rules in a way that's not supposed to be.
As you know well, the issue of WTO reform is very prominent right now. What do you think? How should the WTO reform?
Well, before I left the organization in 2005, you remember, Keith, I actually set up a consultative committee that I asked our former Director General Peter Sutherland to share and to produce a report on the future of the WTO. Firstly, in that report, we try to emphasize the need for the organization to be based on the principle of consensus. But we also made clear in that report that consensus will have to be modified a little bit. For key issues, for important issues, must be consensus. But for what we call less important issues and procedural matters, maybe consensus is not needed. We also propose that the Secretariat be made stronger and the role of the Secretary General, of the Director General of the organization also be made more fortified, more pronounced.
Let me shift to your specific time here at the WTO. What would you say was your most significant achievement as Director General?
That is the time that we've been able to rally the active participation of all countries around the world, particularly the poorer economies, the developing countries. Because I thought before that time when I came to the WTO, it was more or less, I don't want to call it a rich man club, which is maybe a misnomer, but the participation at the global level, global trading system was rather limited. There was no conviction that trade could help to alleviate poverty and could lead into more development and growth and things like that. I think the achievement that I would be proud of is the achievement that we have reactivated the kind of linkages between trade and development in the way that there have been groups of developing countries that have been created that I fully supported so that they can take part actively in trade negotiation.
What was your biggest challenge, your toughest moment?
The Cancun moment, the Cancun Ministerial Conference was my only ministerial conference in my 3-year term. I ideally wanted the Cancun MC to be as successful as possible. I made a lot of preparations. I thought we had the wind in our sail to go to Cancun and produce some results. And yet when I found myself at Cancun and together with all the membership there, I was let down completely. My anxious moment, my concern, my sleepless nights were due to the thing that I saw every day, that the two big groups of developed economies and developing member countries are drifting way and way apart.